All right, Bernie, thanks for taking some time to talk to us about where Remember Warsaw came from as a work of creative art. So, you've talked in the past about how Roger Ames was commissioned to write an oratorio. And so we got this piece of music. How do we go from Roger's commission to write an oratorio to you creating this libretto with this incredible narrative arc? How did that develop?
Over 30 years to where we are now. But in the beginning, Roger had this commission, and Roger had a bone marrow deep integrity in terms of anything that he created. It had to be honest, and it had to ring true to whatever the roots of that project was. And he had written a lot of liturgical music and a lot of other kinds of music. He was a pretty well-known composer. But he got this piece that was supposed to be about the Holocaust. Roger wasn't Jewish. And the subject is overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. So he's trying to write it, and he studies Jewish music, and he studies history, and he studies the Holocaust, but he just doesn't feel he can be authentic to the enormity of the task. So he knew that we had worked together, we were very close, and we'd even played music together. And he knew about my background, and that my father had been in the Polish army when Hitler attacked, and my own roots. So he asked me to do it, and I said, Roger, no way, I'm not doing this, because it's too dark. I don't want to go there. In order to do it, I'd really have to put myself into it, and I know too much about it already. And he goes, okay, I understand. Next day, well, if you were going to do it, I said, I'm not doing it, Roger. But if you were going to, if I was going to do it, what, Roger? He goes, if you were going to do it, where would you start? So I thought, I said, well, Roger, the roots of Judaism in Europe go way, way, way back before the Holocaust and before Hitler. They're deeply embedded into the soil of Europe. And in fact, Poland was a haven for Jews. Poland was the most liberal of societies. They allowed Jewish religion, they allowed Jewish culture, they allowed Jewish governance. So it became, especially Warsaw, became a center of Jewish life of all of Europe. So if I were you, I'm not doing it, but if I were you, I would start by trying to come up with a melody, some kind of modal melody that represented the roots of Judaism in Europe, into the deep soil of what it meant to be Jewish, and without lyrics, no lyrics, just that melody. I said, okay. So I thought I was off the hook, having given him this idea. About a week later, he comes back, he goes, I want you to listen to something. So I go into his room, and he plays me the most beautiful, reeking of Judaism, just bleeding the Jewish soul of Europe. So I said, okay, and that was the beginning. He had me hooked. And we only agreed to two things. One, that we would be totally and completely honest and truthful. And two, that we didn't want to write any sob story about, oh, the poor Jews. We wanted to write the truth of what happened. And somehow we had to get at the truth of what happened. And that was the beginning.
So what led you from that beginning to the characters of Rachel, Aaron, and Joshua?
I didn't get to them right away, because what I wanted to then ask, what I came to ask myself as I studied the Holocaust more and started reading about all that stuff that had happened, although I knew quite a bit, but the destruction of a civilization is an endless topic. So I wanted to figure out how it happened. How do you go from a civilized society, a refined civilized society, claiming in fact to be the most refined civilized society, with some nuisance anti-Semitism, maybe a little bit more than nuisance, but nothing virulent. How do you go from there, from some bigotry, hatred of Jews or hatred of gypsies or whatever, of not being pure? How do you go from there to Auschwitz? How could that possibly happen? How do you go from there to institutionalized, unimaginable, unspeakable horror? And that was the question I wanted the piece to answer. So I studied that process. And then ironically, during the course of that, as I moved through that, with the first, you have to figure out who you hate, which became who was a Jew. How do you define it? The Germans had all this crazy stuff about how big your nose was or your head and this and that and all this crazy neo-scientific bullshit. And then after that, how do you attribute what you want them to do to make them hateful? So you have to put people in a position where they can have no choice but to be exactly that which you then characterize and demonize. And how do you demonize them? And in that process, and how does that work? And then how do you actually figure out the logistics of how you're going to isolate them? And then you get to the ghetto. And then how do you get from the ghetto to how you want to completely annihilate them? And you get to the trains. Trains become a central part of this piece. So I'm studying all of that. Meanwhile, my daughter, who was about 9 or 10 at the time, completely unknown, she didn't have any clue that I was working on this really at all, writes a poem called Courage, which is about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and she wins this award. And we go to the awards ceremony in New York City. It was held at the city legislative body. How big deal? And it's great and wonderful. And I'm reading this poem and I'm going, I have to create characters. I have to create characters because what happens to them? And then the second most important idea of the piece, which Roger really picked up on, was the lives that should have been. And I get to this notion of the show of the should have been, the Holocaust of hope. Because all of those lives, all those individuals should have been something else. Should not have been interrupted by hate, by bigotry, and ultimately by genocide and extinction. So I created the characters because I wanted to create 3 different kind of characters that were overwhelmed by history through no fault of their own, through none of their stuff. And that became a new impulse. So we created a musician because one of the images of the Nazis getting Jewish musicians to play as the trains came in from all over Europe to Poland, where all the extermination camps were. A musician, and then a lawyer, a woman lawyer, study law, which is exactly the exact opposite of the lawless becoming law. And then a brother who didn't want anything to do with it. He wasn't particularly Jewish. He was Jewish, but he wasn't religious. He just wanted to get out and escape it all. He had nothing to do. He didn't want to he didn't want to fight. He didn't want to not fight. He just didn't want to have anything to do with it. He just wanted to find his own life. So they developed as characters over time. And their stories took place inside the bigger story of this incredible movement from bigotry to the ovens.
The character of Rachel is a very strong woman character, which I know, sharing the story with my students, that they found notable that she was a woman of incredible integrity who would stand by her family regardless of personal cost. Was that something that was a deliberate choice of yours?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Strong women. Always strong women. They laughed at me in Minnesota when we were doing this, the second version, and at one point they were saying, that relationship between Josh and he keeps on asking her to do stuff, but she keeps saying, nope, can do it my way. Even though I love you and I will love you, no. And that great moment where she says, because he's connected because of his flute playing and because the Germans like him to play for them, and he's going to play Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and Wagner. So he gets his passport, he can get her out. And there's this very tense argument that they have. And she says, at the end of it, he says, you gotta go, I'll meet you later, we can have a life, we can get out of this. And she goes, no, I refuse. I'm a Jew. I choose to be a Jew.
And I think what is so compelling about watching the Minnesota performance of the oratorio is how convincing she is, and
She was incredible.
and
yeah.
it's incredible. You're watching this, like, what's going to happen next? What's going
Right.
to happen next with these characters, and the choices she makes, but also the legacy of her strength and the way the character Bacha communicates that to the next generation.
The next Rachel.
The next Rachel. At what point in your own creative process did you take that Holocaust of hope and turn it into a story of hope?
It evolved very slowly. I guess it's my own optimism, despite the world that we're even in today, that I think that the human spirit for goodness is stronger than the human spirit for hate. And that's always been part of me. I mean, I'm a teacher. You've got to believe that if you're a teacher. And that didn't really happen until Minnesota. The wonderful version that we did, the first version in Great Neck, which was fabulous, especially musically, didn't have those characters. They developed that to Minnesota, which is why we thought it was a step forward. And even then, we were not done. It was clear that the young Rachel was not developed the way she should have been, nor Bacha, the daughter who was born in Auschwitz and is rescued. It evolved. You know, every time we went back to the piece, I mean, in periods we just left it, but when we went back to it and looked at it with fresh eyes, which you do, you saw that it hadn't found itself yet. It still had more. So, you know, that's why I'm so excited about this next version, because it encompasses all the things that we loved about it and brings those forward to full flower.
Well, I think when I watched the screening, and as you know, I've seen it a bunch of times, but I also think about what amazing teachers you and Roger must have been in the classroom, and what it must have been like to be one of your students, and also to think about the evolution of the creative process, how it's never really done, and how the story keeps speaking to you. And you know, as somebody who comes from outside that tradition, mother raised me a Methodist, right?
And who's also an incredible teacher. I've seen you in your classroom, Sandy. You can teach. You love those kids, and that always comes across.
Well, thanks, Bernie. But what I was about to say was the way that the material can continuously teach you more and open you to more and more of what's possible, and it's a story for all of us, and for the hope that in the darkest of our experiences as a society, as people struggling with what it means to be developed, sophisticated, democratic, what does it really mean to be welcoming to our friends and neighbors and to strangers, and to develop those ideas. And we're never really done. That you're coming back after 30 years and re-engaging the people who were involved in that Minnesota production to revisit all of that again in a new way is just really, really exciting. And so I think as the story itself, the music itself is instructional, but also the process of creating is really powerful too.
Absolutely.
So
You know, Roger did something there that he was an amazing teacher. I could talk about just Roger as a teacher, because very rarely do you have someone who's a genius in their art, which Roger was, who can also teach, and has the humility and to teach, the humility to teach, the humbleness to teach, which is what teaching really requires. He would just let kids be kids, and when he needed them to focus, he would have them focus. But when he didn't need them to focus, you could walk into a Rogers choral and you'd be working with one or two kids, and the other kids are off the wall. So they're just jumping and screaming and having a great time, and he's ignoring them. But when it was time that he needed them, boy, he was like, boom, and they were all right there for him because they loved him. Anyway, so he did something that was one of the most courageous, and I think he did it because he didn't know any better. But the piece that closes it, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead, the Kiddush, the melody of that goes back, I don't know how long, every young Jewish person knows it from temple and just hears it over, over and over again. And I wanted that to close the piece because it's a prayer for hope, and it's a prayer for remembrance, and it's a prayer that says about remembrance being about tomorrow, not just about yesterday, honoring yesterday for tomorrow. So Roger decides he's going to rewrite the melody, which he didn't tell me about. And you should not, I mean, you have to be out of your mind to try to do that, because if you do it, you better do it like a home run in the bottom of the ninth in the World Series, because it has to be unbelievable. And then he did it, and it's unbelievable. He calls it the most beautiful thing he ever wrote. And it is quite remarkable.
Oh, most definitely, Bernie. I cannot wait to see the next production of